it is truly one of the safest places you could be in. I know Japan is also like that. So again, this is not something unique to China, but the point is that it's really important to visit a country like China that is so demonized. And when you come here, you realize that, I mean, they really have figured a lot of things out that are really impressive. And if people in the West were more humble, I think that they could actually stand to learn some of those lessons. That's not to say that every problem is solved. Inequality is a very real issue that China is working on trying to resolve, but they have figured out a lot of things that in the US are very real issues.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I've got with me, for the second time, a wonderful journalist and analyst of world affairs. I'm speaking to Ben Norton, the founder and editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I'm sure you know his channel, and if not, please check it out. There will be links in the description. I watch his programs regularly because of the high value of his analysis. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here, and I admire your program as well.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. But let's now start talking to you because I really would like to use this opportunity to talk about China, your experiences there, and also the way that you see how Chinese people are now approaching world affairs. Because you recently moved from Latin America over to China, where you started in a PhD program at Beijing University. And how is that going for you? How's the research? How was the move? What strikes you? And how's academia in China?
Well, it's been an extremely rewarding, gratifying experience in many ways. I lived in Latin America for several years, and I have traveled a bit around the world in to dozens of countries, but I will be clear that my knowledge of Asia is very limited. This is my first time in East Asia, and uh, in my travels, which were mostly in Latin America and Europe and part of West Asia, the so-called Middle East, you know, I think the cultural zone is very different in East Asia. It's especially China, which has thousands of years of history and has preserved its history in a way from Western interference and influence that very few countries have. I mean, it really is unique. And then, aside from the cultural elements, technologically, it's absolutely amazing because China has developed its own kind of indigenous technologies that are can be used around the world, but are truly unique to China. So, I mean, I actually did a lengthy video explaining some of that. I mean, but it's really fascinating because it made me think much more about the idea of technological sovereignty. Because in my travels, especially in Latin America, which unfortunately has this history of U.S. domination, and you can especially see that clearly in technology. All of the social media platforms, the telecommunications infrastructure, all this is very much dominated by US companies. Whereas in China, everything is Chinese. It's their own indigenous version. So that was a very interesting experience. The language has been very interesting. My Chinese is not very good. I'm probably HSK2, maybe 3, but probably around 2. So I'm still very much in the early stage of learning Mandarin, but picking a lot up. I'm studying it and picking it up through immersion. And that's been an incredible experience because, I had studied Arabic, which is not an Indo-European language, but I mean, Chinese is extremely different from Indo-European languages, the syntax of the language, the grammar. I mean, it's been a very interesting experience because I don't know if there is a more different place you could go to. Now, in terms of politics, it's also been quite interesting because the Western narratives about China are completely absurd when you actually spend time here, and especially in some of the universities, because you see that there is a massive spectrum of opinions, and there actually are a lot of liberals and people who are critical of the government and people who support the government, but people who support the government and have different critiques. I mean, there's a massive spectrum of political views. The idea that China is a monolith is completely preposterous, especially considering that, I mean, in terms of the size of the country, it's like a continent, 1.4 billion people. I mean, I've only been here now nearly 4 months, which is not nearly enough time to get to know the country. And especially, I only really know the areas around Beijing. And again, it's a massive country, so I don't know the South, I don't know the West. So I don't want people to think like I'm an expert on China, but what you especially what you can clearly discern when you spend some time in a Chinese university is that many of the professors will have completely different views. The departments will have completely different views, and they're genuinely. I mean, I'm not saying this to hyperbolize. I genuinely think there's actually more of a political spectrum in Chinese universities than in Western universities, where you often have a much more narrow political spectrum.
That is highly interesting, because the view in the West clearly is that there has to be one opinion. Although I do know from my Chinese students that I have here in Japan that they are very well informed, and people actually know how to speak about politics, also speak in a way that they can. What is your experience when it comes to this spectrum? Is there a lively debate also among the student body? Because one thing about Japan is it is depoliticized. Of course, if you go to a political science course or program, people will talk about politics naturally. But outside, in all the other faculties, especially undergrad, people have no interest in politics. They don't talk politics. You know, and this is on design, in the sense that Japanese politics is so boring. It's so incredibly boring on purpose, because it depoliticizes people, right? How about China? What about your experience at the university?
Well, my program is international political economy. So obviously there's a lot of politics involved, and there's a very vibrant debate. And again, I'm not trying to exaggerate. I'm genuinely serious when I say that there is a more vibrant debate and a wider variety of views in my experience here than in the US university system. I don't know the European universities, but I do know US academia pretty well. And there's this illusion that there is such a wide spectrum, but it's actually pretty narrow, and there are a lot of questions that pretty much everyone agrees on that are the kind of red lines you can't go into. And especially now with what people increasingly call the new Cold War, the very aggressive, what the US calls competition, but really kind of new Cold War policies against Russia and China, discussions over Ukraine and NATO, certainly over Israel Palestine. There are a lot of these third rail issues, and if you challenge some of them, it's very easy to get fired or to not get tenure or to not even get a position.
In
Even
the US.
very in the United States, even very established scholars in the US who have tenure are constantly trying to defend their jobs. I'm thinking, for instance, of Joseph Massad at Columbia University, who's one of the world's most renowned Palestinian scholars who studies the history of Israel Palestine. He has tenure and is constantly trying to defend his job and not get fired by these very McCarthyite campaigns. So the point is that in China there is a huge spectrum, and what's interesting, especially when you see the different universities in Beijing, because of course whenever you travel to a country, especially a very big country, you have to be cognizant of the fact that when you're in the capital city, it tends to be more international, it tends to be wealthier, and especially the intellectuals tend to be liberal in the sense that they tend to often be more sympathetic to the West and things like that. They tend to be wealthier. And especially if you look at the elite universities in China, there are a lot of pro-Western liberals who are critical of the government, but then there are also people who are supportive of the government, especially if you look at the other universities that are not the elite universities. So there genuinely is a very big spectrum. And a lot of people who outside of China have this ridiculous, or frankly, Orientalist perspective that everyone just obediently follows whatever the government tells them, and they all worship Mao and Xi. It's completely preposterous. There is a huge debate, and especially in this moment in China, where there are a lot of changes happening, there is a very vibrant debate. And something that you notice is that a lot of the relatively older professors, obviously I'm in my 30s, but, people maybe in their 50s and 60s, a lot of the professors who started working during the reform and opening up era that began under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, many of them went to the West, especially the United States, to study. They did their doctorates in the United States or Europe, and they tend to be kind of pro-Western liberals. But a lot of the younger generation, especially people, my generation in their 30s, a little younger in their 20s, and who had the experience of like traveling abroad and then coming back to China, a lot of them, especially the ones I've spoken with who went to the US, were actually surprised at the situation in the US economically, the growing inequality, the growing desperation, the poverty, the homelessness, especially for people who visited California. And they come back actually often more proud about the accomplishments and the development in China. And it actually makes them more pro Chinese government than the kind of older generation who grew up when China was still very poor. And they have seen this economic growth, but they come from it from a very different perspective.
I mean, there was this moment when Xi Jinping 3 weeks ago visited, was it San Francisco or LA, right,
Yeah,
to
San
attend a
Francisco.
meeting? San Francisco, right? And then there was this talk about how suddenly a week before the United States started cleaning up San Francisco and even like took the homeless away in order not to be embarrassed. But that's the kind of things. I mean, China lifted about 800 million people out of poverty into the middle class, and there is still a certain level of poverty remaining, especially in the rural areas. But China's actually working on that one, right? Where it seems that in the West, in the United States, but also in Europe, it goes the other way. Governments just don't give a damn about how people live. They tell them in their faces that they have all of these hundreds of billions of dollars to fight a war in Ukraine and pay salaries for Ukrainian employees, and they don't have any kind of salary. There's just no money. There's no money. And that's this neoliberal discourse, right? And I know that you criticize that a lot, but obviously this seems to be going in a different direction in China. Moving there, were you able to kind of already see where public spending is just very different from the US and the West?
Yeah, it's like night and day. I mean, you can see, especially I was born and raised in the US, although I have spent several years living in Latin America. And there are a lot of things that you can also compare between China and Latin America in this regard, where you have governments that actually invest in social programs and safety and infrastructure, just infrastructure alone. I mean, the even comparing the US and Europe, and many countries in Europe have been decreasing their investment in infrastructure over time. And especially this is clear now. We see the German government, which is ostensibly social democratic, but is now, carrying out neoliberal austerity policies. But the point is that despite the austerity policies imposed in the EU for decades now, the social investment is still so much higher than in the US, where every year there are over 1,000 train derailments, and we've seen these huge disasters like in East Palestine, Ohio, which just have been horrible. But in general, I mean, public transportation in the US is basically the worst out of all of the industrialized world. It can't get much worse. So just seeing the trains, I mean, I've ridden on Amtrak trains in the US, which are like a joke. I mean, they're so slow, they're expensive, there are very few lines. Compared to the Chinese trains, I mean, it really is like you're in the future. I've never had the privilege of being in Japan, unfortunately, but I do know that the trains in Japan as well are amazing. And that's another example. I mean, it's not just China, but especially when you consider the size of China and how poor it was just several decades ago, and how quickly it's developed. It truly is incredible. Then another issue is safety. I mean, in addition to the fact that there are no homeless people, I mean, so for instance, I don't only know Beijing. I've been to some of the areas surrounding Beijing, including some of the smaller towns. But I'm not going to lie, I don't know the South and the West because China is massive. And hopefully, I'll be here for several years. I do plan on getting to know more of the country. But the point is that I haven't only been in the city, but I've been to some of the poorer, relatively rural towns surrounding Beijing, and there are no homeless people. Obviously, I'm not, there are a lot of people who have been lifted out of poverty but are still living in very humble conditions, and it still is a developing country. When you have 1.4 billion people, lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty is very ambitious, but extreme poverty is very low. The bar, I mean, is usually around $5 per day, US dollars per day. But moving people out of relative poverty with still the inequality that exists is also very challenging. So the point is that it's still developing, but there are basic things like no homelessness anywhere you go. So everyone has a home. Healthcare is extremely affordable, and this is not just because of the exchange rate. I mean, that's a whole long conversation, but the cost of living in China is so affordable, and it's not just because of the exchange rate. Because what's funny is that Western critics of China will constantly accuse the Chinese government of intentionally devaluing the currency to make their exports more competitive, as if that's like a crime or something. Many countries do that, but the point is that at the same time, they will refuse to measure the size of the Chinese economy using purchasing power parity, so adjusting for the cost of living. Instead, they will use the exchange rate, and then they will do nominal GDP measurements to make the Chinese economy look smaller than it is. So there's like this, have your cake and eat it too approach, which is very biased from some Western scholars. But the point is that the cost of living is so affordable. I mentioned transportation, but security is another part of this. I mean, what's funny is there's all this Western propaganda about like China being this horrible this horrible surveillance dystopia, right? Like there's this idea that you're always being watched and all this. I mean, there are just as many cameras in the US. It's very common in the US, for instance, to have cameras at like some of the main traffic lights. And if you drive by, they'll take a photo of you to measure your speed, and then they'll send you a ticket if you're speeding, right? Those exist in China, obviously, as well. But the difference is there's almost no violent crime. I mean, it's extremely safe, which, for a man, you don't think about as much, but especially for women that I've spoken with, especially, they want to go out with their friends on a Friday or Saturday night or whatever, and they're worried about going home at 2 or 3 a.m. I mean, it is truly one of the safest places you could be in. I know Japan is also like that. So again, this is not something unique to China, but the point is that it's really important to visit a country like China that is so demonized. And when you come here, you realize that, I mean, they really have figured a lot of things out that are really impressive. And if people in the West were more humble, I think that they could actually stand to learn some of those lessons. That's not to say that every problem is solved. Inequality is a very real issue that China is working on trying to resolve. But they have figured out a lot of things that in the US are very real issues, like severe homelessness, severe visible poverty, very degrading infrastructure, horrible public transportation, and a lot of insecurity. Not to mention, of course, the issue of like gun violence, which is just, I mean, that's a very unique US problem. But I think we should have some more humility, people from the US, when we look at countries like China, and there is a lot we can learn.
I absolutely agree, and not just from the US, like from Europe too. We still have this problem that we have this superiority complex that we know everything better, and we will shove that down the throats of these other peoples, right? And China, luckily, like other countries, Japan too, back in the days, but that's more of 100 years ago. But China, like after the Second World War and certain Southeast Asian states, they just didn't heed the advice. They said, "Oh, neoliberal reforms. Okay, let's say we do it, but then we actually don't implement it, and we do exactly what you're pointing out. We develop our own infrastructure." I think there's nothing more important than that, of being able to at least have you know be able to create your own steel and cement, and as you were pointing out with China, it takes it a level further, not just its own trains and roads and so on, but also its own digital infrastructure, which most countries skipped. And I mean, we are using an American software right now to talk to each other. Zoom is American. I mean, everything is American, and you can see how the United States is flipping out at TikTok, although TikTok is by now completely almost 100% US. They cut all ties with China, but still the idea that this is coming from China freaks them out so much that it's almost cute to see. While at the same time they pass laws that their own Apple and Google and so on, they all have to build in backdoors so that the United States can at any time like spy on everybody around the world, right? But they're so afraid that China does the same. The level of projection is just huge. What do you think?
Pascal, if I can interrupt you very briefly, I agree 100%. Those are great points, especially, the US criticizes other countries for supposedly not engaging in, free market economics and violating competition. But as soon as you have a social media platform that is a serious competition, the US is using national security as an excuse to try to destroy that competition. But really briefly, I just want to mention in the issue of Japan. I mean, what's also very interesting is if you do study Japanese development, and again, my field is international political economy. I'm very interested in development economics. That's really my main research. And if you study Japanese development and also South Korean development and Singaporean development, the so-called Asian tigers, right? What you realize is that they did not use the neoliberal development model.
No.
No country that has lifted itself from low income status to high income used the neoliberal development model. In fact, they used very much a state-led development model that has been referred to, ironically, as the old American school of Alexander Hamilton, or the National School. And there's a very interesting article I recently discovered in the Atlantic magazine from the 90s. And it was by one of these Western economists, very neoliberal, who went to Japan, and he realized that all of the Japanese economists working with the government were not neoliberals. They were following Alexander Hamilton and also the German development economist Friedrich List. And in particular, if you look at the National School of Development, the American school, it's no longer American, right? But it used to be referred to that in the 19th century. The idea is you have three main developments that are the thrust of your economic development. So three policies. One, you need to have massive state investment in infrastructure and education. Two, protectionist policies to build infant industries, especially in advanced technologies. And three, some kind of state oversight of the financial system. Now, in the case of China, all of the major banks are owned by the state, and it's socialized banking, which is very important. It's often forgotten, including the four biggest banks in the world in terms of their assets, their balance sheets. But in the case of Japan, what's not that well known is that the Central Bank of Japan was well known for creating what was called window guidance, which was basically a policy where the Central Bank of Japan heavily pressured the banking system to give very favorable loans at very low interest rates for long periods of time to strategic industries in order to build up the tech sector, especially in things like technologies that they used, like first automobiles and motorcycles and such, that led to the creation of the car industries and motorcycles, but also that led to the creation of the big, companies like Sony and others that, started with consumer electronics. That was all done with significant protectionist policies and state support. And in South Korea, it's the exact same story. So the idea that these countries somehow developed using the model that's being imposed by the IMF and the World Bank is actually anachronistic. It's not true historically. And that's why some people say that actually there are more similarities between the Japanese and South Korean and Singaporean development models and the Chinese model than the Western model that they later implemented. And Japan has been in economic stagnation since the 1980s in the Honda Accord, which significantly overvalued the Japanese yen and made it easier to import and increase the purchasing power of Japanese, but also decrease the competitiveness of Japanese exports. And they've been basically in stagnation since the 1980s, when they started moving toward this more neoliberal economic approach.
I completely, utterly agree. I mean, your analysis is 100% correct. The only thing that I would say, having lived in Japan for 10 years, is that whenever the Japanese and the world complains about Japan being in stagnation and, suffering so much, I mean, economy not doing well, this is one of the most developed countries in the world. The standard of living is so high that it's like, what? I mean, yes, there are still problems, but, it's insane. The standard of living over here is insane. So whenever they complain, it seems to me like this kind of, okay, you complain so that nobody looks at you and thinks that you're doing just as bad as everybody else. No, Japan is doing insanely well. And one of the things, that's really interesting, some of the people who, when Japan opened in 1868, one of the first guys to visit the United States is the dude on the 10,000 yen note, Fukuzawa Yukichi. And this guy, he went over to the US and he didn't really speak English, and he was really, really impressed with the level of development. The biggest fear of the Japanese was that they cannot compete with the US because they're literally outgunned, right? Gunboat diplomacy opened Japan. And when he came back, he said, like, okay, the US is much better at producing these things, but we can do the same. We just need to get better. So the spirit that he implemented with a lot of others is like, let's do it as well. And that's very different from the model that was, of course, recommended to developing nations, which is like, just give us your raw materials and we give you all the tech and so on, and you will be happy. And of course, they're not. But
well, the Japanese approach is, it's let's do it as well, but also, in order to build up the competitiveness of these industries, we have to have significant protection of these industries in the form of tariffs and protectionist policies and subsidies. And when they get to the point where the infant industries are strong enough to compete internationally, then we will talk about free trade and all this stuff. But again, free trade is always what's told. The South Korean development economist Ha Jun Chang has shown this very well in his books, like Kicking Away the Ladder. Free trade is always preached by the countries after they develop to a point where they can implement free trade. But when you're still developing, you're not talking about free trade. And that was exactly what happened in Japan.